In the summer of 2001, two casino owners named Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta paid $2 million for a fighting league so controversial it was banned in most U.S. states, dismissed by politicians as human cockfighting, and dropped by nearly every cable provider in the country. 15 years later, they sold that same company, the UFC, for $4 billion. Nothing about the fighting changed. Punches still landed the same way. What changed was something almost invisible to the average fan, and once you understand it, you'll realize sports leagues were never really in the business of sports at all. Picture an NFL team that loses every single game of the season, not one win, total humiliation. By most business logic, that team should be hemorrhaging money. Instead, according to Forbes team valuation estimates, it still walks away with several $100 million in guaranteed revenue before a single ticket is sold. That's not a hypothetical, that's how the system is actually built. So if winning isn't what pays the bills, what is? Go back further to the early 1900s when professional sports looked nothing like the empire it is today. Teams folded mid-season because gate receipts from that week's crowd were often the only money keeping the lights on. If it rained and nobody showed up, the team simply lost money that week, no backup plan. Compare that to today, where the Dallas Cowboys alone carry an estimated valuation north of $9 billion, according to Forbes, more than the entire NFL was worth just a few decades ago. Something fundamental shifted in between, and that shift has a name: television. Once games could be beamed into millions of homes at once, leagues stopped selling tickets to a stadium and started selling access to an audience advertisers were willing to pay enormous sums to reach. In 1998, the NFL signed broadcast agreements across CBS, Fox, and ABC, reportedly worth around $17 billion combined over 8 years before a single snap of those seasons had been played. That deal rewired the entire economics of the league. And here's the detail that explains our losing team from earlier. The NFL pools the bulk of that broadcasting money and splits it almost evenly across all 32 franchises, regardless of their record. A last-place team and the Super Bowl champion cash nearly identical checks from this pool. It's deliberate, designed to stop big market teams from turning the league into a financial mismatch where only rich franchises can compete.
Not every league plays by that rule, and this is where the sport itself starts to shape the business model. In England's Premier League, and even more so in Spain's La Liga, clubs negotiate large portions of their own sponsorship and broadcast arrangements individually rather than splitting a shared pool. That's a major reason Real Madrid and Barcelona became financial giants, while smaller clubs in the same league struggled to keep pace, a gap American leagues have mostly avoided by design. Broadcasting is only one pillar of this business, though, and arguably the most creative one is sponsorship. SoFi Stadium, home to the Rams and Chargers, reportedly signed a naming rights agreement worth around $625 million over 20 years just for a name on the outside of a building. Brands aren't paying for concrete and steel, they're paying for their name to be said out loud by a broadcaster hundreds of times over the course of a single game for 2 decades straight. Ticket sales, the thing most people assume is the entire business, have actually become the smallest piece of the puzzle for many elite teams. At a club like Manchester United, matchday revenue reportedly makes up less than 15% of total income. The stadium hasn't stopped mattering, it's just shifted roles, from primary income source to something closer to a live advertisement for the brand. Then there's merchandising, a pillar that's exploded over the last decade. Every jersey sold, every video game like EA Sports FC using real player likenesses sends licensing revenue back to the league and its athletes. Estimates for the global sports merchandise market place it well above $30 billion a year, and leagues take a meaningful cut of almost all of it. Here's the part that turns all of this into something more than a spreadsheet exercise, though, because none of these numbers exist without an emotional hook underneath them. Fans aren't buying jerseys because they need clothing, they're buying identity. A grandfather passes his team down to his son, who passes it down again, And that inherited loyalty survives losing seasons, bad trades, and years of disappointment that would kill almost any other consumer product on earth. Ask yourself honestly, is there another brand you'd still support financially after a decade of it failing to deliver what you paid for?
But owning a piece of this business isn't free of pain, and player salaries are usually the biggest expense on the ledger. In the NBA, teams operate under a salary cap, a limit on how much they're allowed to spend on player contracts before facing financial penalties. Go over that limit, and the league charges a luxury tax, essentially a fine for having too much talent on one roster. The Golden State Warriors reportedly paid over $170 million in luxury tax penalties in a single season, on top of player salaries themselves, just for the privilege of keeping their championship roster intact. Not every gamble in this industry pays off, and one collapse from 2001 still gets taught as a cautionary tale. The XFL, backed by WWE and NBC, launched with massive hype, promising a louder, edgier alternative to the NFL. It folded after a single season, reportedly losing between $40 and $70 million. The league had spectacle, but it hadn't built the one thing fans actually stay loyal to over years: real rivalries and stories with history behind them. Compare that to the UFC's slow climb from banned pay-per-view curiosity to a $4 billion sale, and the lesson becomes obvious. Manufactured hype fades fast. Built loyalty compounds. Even a business this large isn't immune to sudden shocks. The 2004-2005 NHL lockout wiped out an entire season, with estimates of lost league revenue reportedly reaching around $2 billion. Labor disputes can freeze this machine overnight, and today a newer threat is emerging just as quickly as younger audiences shift towards streaming platforms instead of cable, forcing leagues to renegotiate the broadcasting foundation this entire business was built on barely 2 decades ago. So how do sports leagues actually make their money? Barely from the ticket in your hand or the overpriced hot dog at your seat. Mostly from broadcasting rights distributed to keep every team financially alive, from sponsorships attaching global brands to stadiums and jerseys, from merchandise turning inherited loyalty into recurring revenue, and from a distribution system engineered so carefully that even a last-place team stays profitable enough to keep the whole league standing. The game you watch is the product on the surface. The real business is everything built around it, quietly converting decades of your loyalty into revenue, whether your team wins or loses. Next time your team loses on a Sunday, remember, somewhere in a boardroom, that loss barely shows up on the only scoreboard that actually matters to the